It's October 1919. You know, you're in a crowded town square in Oshkosh, Wisconsin.
Right.
And up on the speaker's platform, the crowd is just absolutely roaring for a legendary brigadier general, a man known as the architect of the famous 32nd Red Arrow Division.
Oh, yeah, a massive figure.
Yeah, it's a welcome home rally for World War I veterans, and the energy is just electric. But standing right next to this towering military figure is a quiet, modest, silver-haired local judge, a guy named George Washington Burnell.
Hmm.
And if you only look at the general, you completely miss one of the most incredible hidden stories of the American Civil War.
It is the absolute classic trap of historical observation.
Yeah.
We are naturally drawn to the brass,
Yeah.
right? The medals, the outsized titles. The primary sources compiled by a local post historian actually reveal that they almost entirely glossed over Judge Burnell at first.
Wait, really?
Yeah, they literally relegated his name to a digital subfolder, just assuming the Brigadier General was the only story worth telling that day.
Wow. But when you actually unpack the primary documents, you know, the letters, the unit histories, the local records, this modest judge, who, by the way, was elected to his post 6 times by the people of Oshkosh,
Right.
he turns out to have been an infantry captain in the Civil War. And the central thesis of the post-historian's research here completely upends how most of us think about warfare.
It really does.
The argument is this. Generals plan the wars, but captains actually fight the battles. Captains make military history.
Which is a profound shift in perspective.
Right.
I mean, what's fascinating here is if we break down the actual military hierarchy of the 19th century, or even today, really, our broad view of history constantly sacrifices the tactical, on-the-ground reality for the strategic general's eye view.
Right.
We read about divisions and corps crashing into each other, but structurally, there are no true fighting formations above the company level.
Wait, hold on. So when we picture a general on a horse commanding 10,000 men to charge across the field, that's a myth. The general isn't actually leading the charge.
It's a massive oversimplification. A general is coordinating pieces on a very large board. A brigade is just an administrative collection of regiments.
Okay.
And a regiment is a collection of battalions. And a battalion is a collection of companies.
Right.
The company, which is roughly 100 men, is the foundational block of combat. The men actually holding the line, firing the muskets, maintaining discipline under fire, and taking the ground. They are organized, trained, and led by captains.
So the captains are the ones in the thick of it.
Exactly. The general might say, take that hill.
Yeah.
But he is entirely reliant on dozens of captains making micro-decisions in the chaos to actually get it done.
Okay, let's unpack this. It's like crediting the CEO for every single widget built on the factory floor, right?
That is a great way to look at it.
While completely ignoring the floor manager who actually sourced the parts, scheduled the labor, and fixed the machinery when it broke down in the middle of the night.
Right.
I mean, the CEO designed the company, sure, but the floor manager actually built the physical product.
The general draws the map, but the captain walks the terrain. And to really understand Judge George Washington Burnell, this captain who walked the brutal terrain of the Civil War, the research insists we have to trace his lineage backward.
Backward into his family history.
Yeah, we have to look at the men whose shoulders he stood on to understand where that specific brand of leadership comes from.
Right, because you don't just wake up one day with that kind of deep civic duty ingrained in your DNA.
No, you don't.
It's an inherited culture. So if Burnell comes from a lineage that views the military not as a career path to glory, but as a mandatory civic chore, where does that actually begin?
Well, the records trace this specific thread of the American dream across generations, starting all the way back in 1775
Okay.
with Captain Joseph Burnell, George's great-grandfather.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was a militia captain in Chesterfield, Massachusetts, which is way out in the western hills of the state.
Now, they didn't fight at Lexington or Concord, right? Chesterfield wasn't a battlefield. So why is a rural militia captain so important to this lineage?
Because warfare is about logistics, just as much as it is about shooting.
Yeah.
While they didn't see the smoke of the battlefield, Josephstown was the logistical backbone of the region. As a selectman and a militia captain, his job was to train the local men, maintain the powder stores, keep civil order, and supply the Continental Army.
Right.
We often forget that armies need to eat, and towns like Chesterfield milled the grain and procured the supplies that kept the Revolution from starving to death.
And the research highlights an insane logistical feat in 1777. After the British surrendered at Saratoga, this massive column of over 5,000 prisoners.
The Convention Army.
Yeah, the Convention Army. They were marched right through tiny Chesterfield. How does a frontier town even begin to process 5,000 prisoners of war?
It requires immense civic organization. I mean, you have to imagine the sheer scale of the disruption.
5,000 hungry, exhausted men suddenly appearing in a town of a few hundred people.
Exactly. The local militia, led by men like Joseph Burnell, had to act as guards, quartermasters, and diplomats all at once.
Wow.
They had to requisition food from local farms without causing a riot among their own citizens, secure encampments, and keep the column moving. The fact that the Continental authorities routed the prisoners through this town shows they trusted the local leadership implicitly.
So they were capable.
Highly capable. Joseph Burnell exemplifies the citizen soldier. He was a farmer and a miller who took up arms because his community needed him to.
And he passes that baton to his son, Manasseh Burnell, born in 1760.
Yeah.
And Manasseh eventually moves to the Vermont frontier. The documents suggest he likely served in the War of 1812, guarding the incredibly strategic Lake Champlain corridor from British invasion.
That's what the research points to, yeah.
And then Manasseh's son, Elias Burnell, is a farmer in Vermont in the 1820s and 30s. This is a time of high border tensions, like the Aroostook War.
Which, for context, was a highly volatile, though ultimately bloodless, border confrontation between the U.S. and the British over the international boundary between Maine and New Brunswick.
Oh.
It was driven by competing lumber operations, and it required local militias across New England to be on high alert, constantly drilling and preparing for a potential shooting war with the British Empire.
Okay, I struggle with this next part, though.
Oh.
Yeah, the Post historian explicitly notes that there are basically no surviving militia muster rolls for Manasseh or Elias.
That's right.
If I'm a historian, how do I justify writing down that a man was a soldier just because a town ordinance said he should be? Weren't there draft dodgers back then?
Of course there were.
So if we don't have the paperwork, aren't we just making a massive historical guess?
This raises a fascinating question about how history is actually written, particularly frontier history. Whereas the classic fragmentary archive problem.
Fragmentary archive.
Yeah. We're heavily conditioned today to believe that if it isn't on a piece of paper or a digital file, it simply didn't happen.
Right, pics or it didn't happen.
Exactly. But we have to distinguish between a documentary fact, like a signed piece of paper, and a historically sound deduction based on civic law and the physical reality of the time.
Meaning the law itself is the evidence.
Precisely. During the eras when Manasseh and Elias lived, Vermont law didn't just suggest militia service. It mandated universal participation for all able-bodied men within a certain age bracket.
Oh, I see.
It wasn't an opt-in system. It was automatic upon reaching adulthood. The towns were legally required to conduct rigorous training days, and the social pressure in these small, interdependent frontier communities made dodging the draft nearly impossible.
Because everyone knew everyone.
Right. You couldn't just hide out. Your neighbors relied on you to defend the perimeter.
So why are their names missing?
Because Vermont didn't centralize its militia records at the state level until the 1840s. Before that, the captain of a local company might literally just keep the roster in his coat pocket.
You're kidding.
No, or in a desk drawer at his farm. When he died, or the town hall flooded, or the paper simply rotted, the record vanished. So, given their location on a tense, disputed border, their age, their physical capability as farmers, and their family's deeply rooted culture of service, concluding that they didn't serve would actually require a much larger, historically unreasonable leap of logic.
That makes perfect sense. The environment and the law practically forced their participation, whether a piece of paper survived or not.
Exactly.
So if Burnell comes from this intense lineage that views military service as a mandatory civic chore, how does that manifest when the Civil War actually breaks out? Because Elias has a son in 1839, and he literally names him George Washington Burnell.
Setting the bar for civic expectation incredibly high from day one.
Right. George grows up in this very stable, literate, civic-minded Vermont household. He's ambitious. He goes to Albany Law School in New York.
Yes.
And the research stresses that in the late 1850s and early 60s, Albany law was elite. It was older and more established than Columbia's or Cornell's law programs.
It was an incredibly rigorous, intellectually demanding environment. He wasn't just reading dusty theories. He was deep into Blackstone's commentaries, analyzing constitutional law, and wrestling with the brand new Field Code of Civil Procedure.
Let's pause on the Field Code, because I think a lot of people might not know why that makes his education so rigorous.
Sure. So David Dudley Field was a legal reformer who spearheaded a massive overhaul of how law was practiced in New York.
Okay.
Before the Field Code, lawyers had to navigate this archaic, confusing labyrinth of British common law, where the actual procedure of a trial often mattered more than the facts of the case.
Sounds like a nightmare.
It was. The Field Code ripped all that down and replaced it with a codified statutory system of rules. It was revolutionary, but it meant law students like Burnell were on the cutting edge. They were required to memorize and apply entirely new systems of logic in daily recitations and grueling moot courts led by practicing judges. He was being trained to think with absolute structural precision.
And he graduates in June of 1862. This is the bloody, terrifying second year of the Civil War. Casualties are mounting.
Yes.
Lincoln is president. Lincoln is a lawyer. Imagine graduating top of your class from Harvard Law today, having a direct line to a safe job in the Pentagon or the Justice Department, and choosing instead to go to a muddy boot camp as an enlisted private just so you can serve with your neighbors.
It's hard to fathom.
It defies modern logic, but that is exactly what George does. He goes back home to Vermont and enlists in the 10th Vermont Volunteer Infantry as a private. Why would an elite law graduate deliberately choose to start at the absolute bottom of the infantry?
Well, it comes down to understanding the highly localized, deeply political nature of officer commissions in a state like Vermont at the time.
Okay.
Commissions were not handed out based on merit or fancy out-of-state degrees. They were political appointments, distributed by the state governor.
So it's a who-you-know kind of thing.
Very much so. They went to older men with pre-war militia experience, immense local influence, or deep political connections in the state legislature.
And George is just out of law school.
Right. George was in his early 20s. He'd been away in New York studying, and by the time he returned in the late summer of 1862, most of the coveted officer slots in his local regiment were already spoken for by local politicians and businessmen.
He still could have leveraged his degree for a staff position somewhere safe, though.
He absolutely could have.
But his choice to grab a heavy Springfield musket, put on an itchy wool uniform, and stand in the mud with the guys he grew up with shows a stunning lack of ego.
It perfectly aligns with the legacy of his father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather.
Yeah.
In that civic lineage, you do not elevate yourself above the needs of your community. You serve exactly where you are needed, beside the men you know.
Before we track George's specific rise through the ranks, the research actually pauses his personal timeline to establish the extreme stakes in the ethos of the 10th Vermont.
Right.
And it does this by looking at the mechanics of Civil War battle through something very visual, which is their regimental colors.
The flags.
Yes, the flags. We see them in museums today and think they look pretty, but what was their actual function?
But understand a Civil War regiment, you have to understand its colors. In 19th century combat, flags were the absolute tactical center of a regiment's existence.
Walk us through the physical reality of a battlefield, because it explains why these flags mattered so much. We're talking black powder weapons.
Exactly.
After the first volley of a battle, what does a soldier actually see?
Almost nothing. Black powder produces thick, choking, heavy white smoke that just hangs in the air. Within minutes, a battlefield becomes an opaque fog. You can't see your hand in front of your face.
Wow.
Combine that with the deafening, bone-rattling roar of massed artillery and thousands of muskets firing. You cannot hear a shouted order from a captain standing 10 feet away. There are no radios.
So the flag is essentially the regiment's GPS and heartbeat combined.
Exactly. The men were meticulously trained to align their physical formations on the colors. The color guard stood in the center of the line. If the flag moved forward through the smoke, you advanced. If the flag fell back, you retreated.
And if it goes down?
If the flag went down and stayed down, the unit would lose its physical alignment. In the chaos, men would lose their spatial awareness, scatter, and break. And once a regiment breaks and runs, it is incredibly difficult to rally them.
That makes a lot of sense.
Furthermore, captured flags were highly prized trophies. The enemy could even use captured colors deceptively to lure Union troops out of position.
So if the flag goes down, you are blind, bleeding, and vulnerable to total collapse.
That is the grim reality. And the research highlights a profoundly dramatic moment that exemplifies the spirit of the 10th Vermont, the Battle of Monocacy, in July 1864.
Now, just to be clear chronologically, George Washington Burnell had actually transferred out of this unit by the time Monocacy happened.
Right, yep.
But the Post historian includes this event to demonstrate the caliber of men Burnell trained alongside and the unyielding culture he helped build. Monocacy is often called the battle that saved Washington, D.C. The Confederate General Jubal Early was marching a massive force right toward the capital, and a vastly outnumbered Union force, including the 10th Vermont, had to stand in their way and buy time.
The fighting was blistering. I mean, the Union lines were buckling under sheer numerical superiority. And as the 10th Vermont was being forced into a desperate withdrawal under overwhelming fire, their color bearers were shot down.
Oh, no.
Yeah, the flags, both the national U.S. flag and the blue regimental flag of Vermont, were falling to the dirt.
If they leave those flags behind, it's not just a devastating loss of honor.
No.
The retreating men might lose their anchor and turn it into a panicked rout, which would let the Confederates sweep right through them. But Corporal Alexander Scott of Company D steps up.
You have to picture the sheer physical difficulty of what happens next. These are heavy silk banners mounted on thick, unwieldy wooden poles that are 8 to 9 feet long.
They catch the wind.
They catch the wind. They are heavy, and they are giant, vibrant bullseyes for enemy sharpshooters. Under a sheer storm of Confederate musketry, Corporal Scott grabs not just one, but both flags. He scoops up both massive poles and carries them off the field, refusing to let them fall.
How does one man even run while holding two giant sails in a headwind of bullets? Superhuman.
It really is.
But because he does it, he ensures the regiment's identity survives the day. By keeping their focal point organized, the 10th Vermont withdraws in order, slowing the Confederates down just enough for Union reinforcements to reach the defenses of D.C.
Corporal Scott wins the Medal of Honor for it. And the official citation is remarkably understated. It simply reads, "Carried the colors off the field under heavy fire."
That's it.
That's it. It's brief, but it encapsulates the total devotion to duty and absolute disregard for personal safety that defined the Civil War color bearer.
So, returning to George Washington Burnell's own timeline, we have this Ivy League tier lawyer serving as a private in this incredibly disciplined, hard-fighting unit. How does he actually perform in the field?
Well, his intellect and competence are impossible to hide. By the time the regiment musters in, he's made second sergeant. Okay. Within 4 months, by January 1863, he is promoted to second lieutenant.
What does a second lieutenant actually do in 1863?
It's a massive transition from enlisted leadership to commissioned responsibility. He is now responsible for the administrative machinery of the company.
Like paperwork.
Lots of paperwork, managing the complex muster rolls, supply requisitions, and payroll. But tactically, he is responsible for positioning the line, managing the file closers who keep the men from running away during combat, and executing the complex drill maneuvers required to move 100 men from a marching column into a line of battle.
So his legal training actually helps here.
Very much so. His ability to memorize rules and apply precise logic made him uniquely suited to master the tactical manuals.
Which leads us right into the brutal grind of 1863. After missing the fighting at Gettysburg because they were guarding the supply lines in Maryland, the 10th Vermont joins the frantic pursuit of Robert E. Lee's retreating army. And this brings them to the Battle of Wapping Heights in July 1863.
This is a crucial, often overlooked moment in the war. General George Meade is desperately trying to trap Lee's army in the mountain caps before they can escape south into Virginia.
Okay.
At Wapping Heights, the Union Army has a real, tangible opportunity to strike a decisive war-ending blow. The 10th Vermont is part of the assault force advancing up the rugged terrain toward the gap.
But the commanding Union general on the field, General French, hesitates.
He does.
He pauses, waits for reinforcements that he doesn't necessarily need, and delays the assault.
And in warfare, time is the single resource you cannot manufacture or recover.
Yeah.
The why of French's hesitation is debated, but the how is mathematical.
Yeah.
By waiting hours to attack, he allows the Confederates the time they need to stabilize their defenses and eventually slip away during the night.
And the 10th Vermont.
They acted as a highly disciplined supporting element during the fighting that did happen, pushing up the steep slopes. But the strategic window had closed.
And because of that missed opportunity, the rest of 1863 devolves into this grueling, miserable slog of high maneuver warfare. The Bristow and Mine Run campaigns.
Oh, just awful conditions.
Long, exhausting marches through mud and freezing rain. And Mine Run in late November sounds particularly terrifying. The Union forces cross the Rapidan River and find the Confederates heavily entrenched on a ridge behind a creek on the high ground.
General Meade positions his forces, including Burnell and the 10th Vermont, for a massive, coordinated frontal assault. The men of the 10th Vermont are moved into position in the dark, and they spend the night in sub-freezing conditions, unable to light fires, just waiting for the dawn order to charge.
So what does this all mean? Expand on the psychological burden of that night. They can see the open fields they have to cross. They can see the fresh dirt of the enemy artillery emplacements. They know mathematically it's going to be a slaughter, but they sit in the freezing cold and stand ready anyway.
The psychological toll is almost unimaginable for us today. You are sitting in the freezing mud for hours, shivering, listening to the enemy dig their trenches.
Wow.
You are writing your name on a slip of paper and pinning it to your coat so your body can be identified later. You have accepted your own death. Surviving that kind of anticipatory dread requires a profound, unnatural level of discipline.
But the dawn charge doesn't happen.
No, it doesn't. In a pivotal moment in the evolution of Civil War command, General Meade personally inspects the lines at dawn. He looks through his field glasses at the Confederate entrenchments, looks at the frozen creek his men have to cross, and realizes it would be suicidal.
He remembers Fredericksburg.
Exactly. He remembers the horrific, pointless slaughter of Union troops at Fredericksburg the previous year under similar conditions. And in an act of immense moral courage, he cancels the attack. He calls it off, and eventually orders the army to retreat.
The men are spared the bullets, but what does it take to survive that mental whiplash? You brace yourself to die, and then you are told to stand down and march back through the mud.
It shows that the 10th Vermont had matured into a highly reliable, hardened veteran force. A lesser regiment might have broken under the sheer frustration and psychological strain of marching for days just to retreat. But they maintained their cohesion.
And Burnell's performance as a lieutenant during all this marching, waiting, and enduring clearly catches the eye of his superiors, because in January 1864, Burnell makes a dramatic pivot. He leaves the 10th Vermont.
He is chosen for a highly sensitive, radically different new command.
Okay.
The Union Army is expanding, a relatively new, incredibly vital branch of the military, and they are aggressively recruiting capable, intelligent, morally sound officers from existing regiments to lead it.
And Burnell gets the call?
Yes. Burnell is commissioned as a captain of Company C in the 19th Regiment of United States Colored Troops.
The 19th, USCT. He goes from being a private, then a lieutenant, in a local regiment of guys from his hometown, to a captain leading formerly enslaved men who are fighting for their own liberation.
It's a huge leap.
And the motto of this new unit just stops you in your tracks. We will prove ourselves men.
So, picture the tactical board. In, I guess it's January 1864.
Okay.
You've got the Army of the Potomac settling into winter quarters and, knowing full well that when the mud dries, Grant is going to launch the Overland Campaign.
Right, which everyone knows means a grinding, just relentless war of attrition.
Exactly. Yeah. So put yourself in this position. You are an officer in the 10th Vermont.
Yeah.
You're in a veteran, battle-tested regiment. You know the men to your left and right. Supply lines are established.
Yeah.
And right before the hammer drops, you just, you voluntarily walk away.
Yeah.
You resign your slot to take a commission in a unit that literally does not exist yet.
It completely defies conventional military career logic, doesn't it? Leaving a cohesive unit right before a major offensive just to, start from scratch.
It really does.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to put it in modern terms, it's like a senior executive leaving a massive, established Fortune 500 company the week before their biggest product launch, just to go run a totally untested startup in a completely unproven market, and doing it simply because he believes the startup is going to fundamentally change the world.
That's a great way to frame it. Because we aren't just looking at troop movements on a map here.
Right.
We're examining the actual mechanics of how a group of formerly enslaved men learned the literal physical reality of a military identity, and how they ultimately became the immovable force that brought the Army of Northern Virginia to its knees.
Let's look at the mechanics of this transfer, because Burnell is such an interesting case study.
Yeah.
He's got a background from Albany Law School.
Yeah.
So he's clearly educated, rising quickly. But he opts to take a captain's commission in the 19th USCT. Now, the Union Army is actively expanding its black regiments at this point, but commanding them wasn't just another officer gig.
No, absolutely not.
I mean, the Confederate government had passed laws stating that white officers commanding black troops were inciting servile insurrection. If you got captured, you weren't going to a POW camp.
Right, you were facing a firing squad, or honestly worse,
No.
which completely changes the psychological profile of the men stepping up for these commissions. Leading the USCT required officers of exceptional intelligence, iron discipline, and a very specific moral resolve.
Because they knew it was on the line.
Exactly. The War Department set up rigorous examination boards for these officer candidates, and they were far stricter than what many white volunteer regiments went through. They knew these officers were going to be under immense political and tactical scrutiny. The source material actually frames this perfectly. It calls it the world's first war against social evolution.
Oh, wow. That is a heavy mandate. You aren't just fighting the Army of Northern Virginia.
Precisely. Burnell was stepping into a role where he had to seize and secure the moral high ground while simultaneously teaching complex infantry tactics.
Right.
He had to take men who, just months prior, were legally forbidden from reading or writing or even owning their own bodies and mold them into a cohesive, lethal fighting force.
You can see that existential weight in the regimental motto they adopted, which was, "We will prove ourselves men."
Yes.
That is not your standard, death before dishonor military platitude. That is a legal and philosophical declaration.
It absolutely is.
But I do want to push back on the timeline for a second.
Yep.
Burnell leaves the 10th Vermont in January 1864. The Wilderness and Spotsylvania are just around the corner. Did his old unit, or just the military establishment in general, look at this transfer and think, oh, this lawyer is finding a convenient desk job back at Camp Stanton to avoid the meat grinder?
I mean, it's a cynical way to look at it, but that was certainly a common sentiment among some of the older, prejudiced elements of the Army at the time.
Okay.
However, the military reality of Burnell's specific assignment dictates otherwise. His departure wasn't a retreat. The examination boards didn't hand out captaincies to shirkers. They needed proven combat competence.
Right.
He was taking a command position that would actually test him far more profoundly, because he had to build a company from the ground up, handle all the logistical nightmares of a new unit, and prepare them to face an enemy that harbored a deeply violent, specifically racial hatred toward them.
And it's not like they spent the rest of the war marching on parade grounds in Maryland either. By May and June of 1864, the 19th USCT is thrown into the Virginia theater.
Yeah.
But they aren't immediately slotted into the headline-grabbing frontal assaults. The source details this fascinating kind of unglamorous transition period.
Right. They are experiencing the grueling realities of 19th century soldiering, which, is mostly not shooting. It's marching through dense, suffocating Virginia forests. It's sudden, sharp skirmishes with Confederate cavalry pickets. And above all, it's the exhausting, back-breaking labor of building entrenchments.
Digging trenches under fire. It's hard to overstate how physically destroying that is. You're swinging a pickaxe in the humid Virginia summer, knowing a sharpshooter is just waiting for your head to pop above the parapet.
It was miserable work, but mechanically it was the exact crucible this new unit needed. Cohesion isn't built in a single heroic charge.
Right.
It's built in the shared misery of fatigue duty.
Right.
Under Burnell's calm, consistent authority, the men of Company C learned discipline under immense prolonged strain. They learned how to operate as a single organism under fire.
It's the idea of psychological inoculation. If you can keep your nerve while hauling timber for a redoubt with artillery bursting over your head, you can keep your line dressed when the actual infantry assault comes.
Exactly.
And they needed every ounce of that discipline because by mid-June 1864, the mobile war essentially stops. Both armies hit the brakes and dig in outside of Petersburg.
The siege. The strategic situation is a stalemate. The Union IX Corps, which the 19th USCT is attached to, is manning the trenches on the eastern approaches to the city. And if you read the source's sensory details regarding these trenches, it's appalling.
It sounds like the Western Front in World War I, just 50 years earlier.
Yes, exactly.
Knee-deep, stagnant mud, the smell of latrines and shallow graves, disease is rampant. And you have this constant grinding psychological terror. It's not a pitched battle where adrenaline carries you through.
No.
It's waking up every day knowing a mortar shell could drop directly into your breakfast fire.
And this is where the dynamic between Burnell and Company C really solidifies, because in a siege, morale can rot faster than the rations. An officer's job shifts from directing fire to maintaining basic human resilience.
Yeah.
But as the stalemate drags into late July, the strategic calculus changes because of one of the most audacious engineering feats in military history.
The mine at Elliott Salient.
Exactly. The 48th Pennsylvania Infantry, which was packed with former anthracite coal miners from Schuylkill County, proposed digging a 500-foot tunnel directly beneath the Confederate earthworks.
Wow.
The plan was to pack the end of it with 8,000 pounds of gunpowder, detonate it, and blow a catastrophic hole in the Confederate defensive line.
Which is insane when you think about the lack of institutional support they had. The engineering corps thought it was impossible to ventilate a tunnel that long.
Right, they were entirely dismissed.
The miners had to forage for their own lumber and use modified cracker boxes to haul the dirt out. But they do it. They actually build the thing. And here is where the trajectory of Burnell and the 19th USCT sharply intersects with this massive gamble, because the USCT division was explicitly chosen and trained to spearhead this assault.
This is a crucial point of historical mechanics. You don't just blow a hole and yell charge. The 19th USCT and their sister regiments were pulled off the line specifically to train for this exact tactical maneuver. They built mock-ups. They drilled relentlessly on how to advance around the immediate rim of the crater, not into it.
That's the key part.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were trained to sweep left and right down the Confederate trenches to widen the breach, while following waves would push straight through the gap and secure the high ground at Cemetery Hill, getting into the Confederate rear.
They had the geometry of the assault down to a science. Burnell's men knew exactly what their job was. Success here doesn't just break the siege, it potentially ends the war a year early. But then, less than 24 hours before the attack, we get one of the most infuriating, disastrous command pivots of the entire war.
General George Meade intervenes.
And not for any tactical reason. Meade looks at the board and suddenly worries about the optics in Washington.
Yeah.
He fears that if the black troops lead the charge and the attack fails, if they suffer massive casualties, he and Burnell's commanders will be hauled in front of the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War.
Right.
And they'll be accused of using the USCT as cannon fodder.
This raises an important question. What happens to the structural integrity of a military operation when political self-preservation overrides tactical preparation?
Nothing good.
The answer is almost always catastrophic failure. To avoid the political risk of sacrificing black soldiers, Meade orders the USCT division to be held in the rear. He replaces them with the 1st Division under General James Ledlie.
Who were white troops, but more importantly, troops who had literally zero training for this highly specialized operation.
Not at all.
They'd been sitting in the trenches getting shot at for weeks, they were exhausted, and they had absolutely no idea about the complex echelon movements required to secure the breach. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. To avoid a slaughter, Meade effectively guarantees one.
The tactical collapse begins before the fuse is even lit. July 30th, 1864, the Battle of the Crater. Before dawn, the 8,000 pounds of powder are detonated. The sheer physics of the explosion are apocalyptic.
Just can't even imagine.
Over 300 Confederate defenders are instantly vaporized or buried. It tears a hole in the earth roughly 170 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 30 feet deep. The Confederate line is completely broken.
It's a gaping, undefended door straight into Petersburg. But Ledlie's untrained white divisions advance, and because they haven't been drilled on the geometry of the crater, they do exactly what you naturally do when you encounter a massive obstacle.
Right.
They take the path of least resistance. Instead of fanning out around the rim to secure the flanks, they march straight into the 30-foot pit.
It becomes a lethal funnel. You suddenly have thousands of Union soldiers milling around at the bottom of a steep, loose clay pit. They can't climb out, their command structure dissolves, and they are completely disorganized.
And worse, General Ledlie isn't even out there directing them. He's famously sitting in a bomb-proof bunker behind the lines drinking rum.
The failure of leadership was total. And this gave the Confederates the one thing you can never give an enemy in a breakthrough scenario: time. General William Mahone, one of Lee's most aggressive divisional commanders, rapidly organizes a counterattack.
Yeah. He moves his infantry up to the rim of the crater, looks down at this massive cluster of trapped Union soldiers, and they just open up. They are firing muskets and plunging artillery directly down into the mass of bodies. It's not a battle at that point, it's an execution.
Yes.
And it is only now, hours into this cascading disaster, with the element of surprise completely gone and Mahoney's veterans fully entrenched on the rim, that the USCT, including Burnell's 19th, is finally ordered to advance.
Think about the psychological discipline required in this moment. Burnell and his men have been listening to the slaughter. They know the plan has failed. Yet when the order comes, they advance into the meat grinder.
Wow.
And their performance is staggering. Despite charging into a prepared, fully alerted Confederate counterattack, the USCT divisions managed to push farther past the crater and deeper into the Confederate lines than any other Federal troops that entire day.
They are trying to execute the original training by sheer force of will, but they are completely unsupported, taking flanking fire from both sides. And this is where the story shifts from a macro tactical failure to a deeply intimate, terrifying reality for Company C. Because in the absolute worst of this chaotic close-quarters fighting, Captain George Washington Burnell is hit.
He goes down under heavy Confederate fire.
I want to just pause and look at the absolute horror of this specific moment on the field, because we really need to emphasize this. The source material is very clear about what the USCT was facing.
Very clear.
Confederate troops under Mahone were furious about the mine, and they were enraged at the sight of armed black soldiers. They were openly shouting, "No quarter." They were executing disarmed USCT prisoners on the spot, bayoneting men who had surrendered.
It was a racially motivated massacre inside a tactical collapse. The normal rules of engagement were entirely abandoned by the Confederate defenders.
Right. So if you are a private in Company C and your commanding officer goes down, the tactical situation is hopeless. The smoke is blinding, the noise is deafening, and you are facing an enemy that wants to murder you purely for existing in a uniform.
Yeah.
Your biological imperative, the deepest human instinct, is to run, to fall back, blend into the chaos, and try to survive.
But this is where the time spent digging those trenches, the grueling months of establishing cohesion, reveals its true value. When Burnell falls, the men of Company C make a conscious, collective decision.
Yeah.
They stop. Under a withering volume of fire, they refuse to leave their captain.
Here's where it gets really interesting, just thinking about it physically. They literally pick him up. Think about the physics of that. You are trying to lift a grown man wearing wool soaked in sweat and blood, probably weighing close to 200 pounds of dead weight.
It's incredible.
You have to sling him onto your shoulders. By doing that, you can't hold your rifle. You can't run. You have just turned yourselves into a massive, slow-moving cluster in the middle of a shooting gallery where the enemy is explicitly trying to annihilate you.
Structurally speaking, in 19th century warfare, unit cohesion often evaporated the second the officer corps was incapacitated. The men would break and run.
Right.
The fact that these soldiers who had been denied their fundamental humanity their entire lives held their discipline and prioritized the life of their white commanding officer over their own survival while surrounded by an enemy intent on their extermination is one of the most profound testaments to military brotherhood in the entire war.
It is the ultimate manifestation of their motto. We will prove ourselves men. They proved it in the most harrowing, selfless way imaginable. They carried Captain Burnell all the way back to the mud, the smoke, and the panic, back to the Union lines, and they saved his life.
It's a remarkable act of localized victory inside a massive strategic defeat, because the Battle of the Crater ends as a total disaster for the Union, over 5,500 casualties. Grant later testified it was the saddest affair he had witnessed in the war.
So the mine fails, the siege resumes. What happens to Burnell?
The physical toll on Burnell is severe. He survives the extraction, but his wounds require prolonged hospitalization. On the regimental mourning reports and muster rolls, his status shifts to absent, wounded.
Okay.
Now, this is a critical administrative detail. Many officers in his position, having fulfilled their duty and taken a severe wound, would resign their commission, take a pension, and go home. Burnell does not. He remains officially on the books. He stays attached to Company C.
Meanwhile, the men who saved him are still in the trenches, and they stay there through the fall of 1864 and into the brutal winter of 1865. The source material outlines this period of grinding attrition. It's not glorious charges. It's the constant picket duty in the freezing rain, dodging sniper fire, and watching men drop from dysentery and exposure.
The siege becomes a war of logistics and endurance, and this is where Burnell re-enters the picture. By late 1864, his status updates to present on detached duty.
Which means he's back with the Army, but he's physically unfit for frontline combat, so he's assigned to administrative tasks. And I gotta say, as a reader, there's a part of you that feels a little let down by that.
Oh, sure.
You survive the crater, you get this heroic rescue by your men, and your next act is, what, filling out requisition forms and managing supply chains in a muddy tent.
It lacks the cinematic glory of a bayonet charge, certainly. But mathematically, it is exactly what keeps an army alive. In protracted siege, logistics are the primary weapon.
Yeah, that makes sense.
An officer who can navigate the arcane bureaucracy of the Union quartermaster system, who can ensure that his regiment gets its proper allocation of hardtack, winter coats, and ammunition, is saving more lives than a frontline sharpshooter. Burnell's administrative competence was the lifeblood of the 19th USCT's endurance.
That's a very fair point. He's ensuring that the men who literally carried him off the battlefield don't freeze or starve to death during the winter. He's keeping the machine running. And they needed that machine operating at peak efficiency, because in the spring of 1865, the dam finally breaks.
April 10, 1865. Grant launches a massive offensive that shatters the Confederate right flank at Five Forks. This is the death blow because it severs the South Side Railroad, which was Robert E. Lee's last remaining supply artery into Petersburg.
The moment that rail line is cut, the strategic geometry of the entire war collapses. Lee knows if he stays in the trenches, his army will be encircled and starved within days. He issues the immediate evacuation orders for both Petersburg and Richmond.
And on April 3rd, the Union forces pour into the abandoned Confederate works. The XXV Corps, which was created in late 1864 and was entirely composed of USCT regiments, including the 19th, is positioned right on the eastern defenses. They are among the very first federal troops to march into the fallen city of Petersburg.
The symbolism of that is incredible, but they don't have time to celebrate because Lee is on the run. He is frantically trying to move his starving army 80 miles west toward Amelia Courthouse, desperately hoping to find supply trains full of rations. Spoiler alert for Lee, the rations aren't there.
What follows is an 80-mile, rolling, chaotic fighting retreat. Grant Tara's forces are relentless. You have Phil Sheridan's cavalry acting as the hammer, constantly swinging around and smashing into the Confederate vanguard and flanks, while the infantry acts as the anvil, applying unrelenting pressure from the rear.
And the 19th USCT is in that infantry pursuit. They aren't the shock cavalry leading the headline charges at this point, but they are providing the inescapable, crushing weight of the pursuit. They are fast-marching day and night, securing vital crossroads, occupying abandoned positions, and physically tightening the noose, so Lee has nowhere to turn but further west.
You see the Confederate Army disintegrating in real time. At the Battle of Sailor R's Creek on April 6, nearly a quarter of Lee's remaining effective force is cut off and forced to surrender, including General Ewell. Then, on April 8th, Sheridan's cavalry reaches Appomattox Station and captures the last remaining supply trains Lee was aiming for.
The trap snaps shut. Lee Ray's army is cornered at a place called Appomattox Court House, which brings us to the morning of April 9, 1865. This is the climax. Lee Ray's army is exhausted, out of ammunition, and effectively surrounded. But Robert E. Lee is a stubborn tactician, and he's not ready to throw in the towel.
Lee orders his trusted subordinate, General John B. Gordon, to launch one final desperate breakout attempt toward Lynchburg. The tactical logic is simple. If Gordon can punch a hole through the Union cavalry screen ahead of them, the remnants of the Army of Northern Virginia can escape into the mountains and transition into a grueling guerrilla war.
Gordon's infantry forms up in the early morning fog, and they advance. And initially it works. They hit the Union cavalry skirmishers, push them back, and for a fleeting moment, it looks like the breakout is going to succeed.
Right.
The Confederate lines push forward through the mist, expecting to see open road to Lynchburg. But as the fog literally clears, they suddenly halt.
They halt because the Union cavalry hasn't just retreated. They've pulled aside like a curtain. And standing directly in Gordon's path, in full battle formation, is Major General Edward Ordaz's Army of the James. And forming the absolute center of that impenetrable wall is the XXV Corps.
The United States colored troops, including the 19th Regiment.
Yes. Gordon's exhausted Confederate veterans look across the field and realize they are not facing a thin screen of dismounted cavalry. They are facing an entire corps of disciplined, hardened, heavily armed black soldiers, the very men they had fought a war to keep enslaved.
That is just, it gives you goosebumps. Gordon realizes the tactical reality immediately. He doesn't even order the charge. He sends a staff officer writing frantically back to Robert E. Lee with a message that essentially ends the American Civil War. Gordon says, "My lines can advance no further."
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the historical resonance of this exact moment is almost too perfect for fiction. The 19th USCT. Men who were held back at the crater because politicians viewed them as a liability. Men who had to bleed just to be recognized as human beings under the laws of war, became the literal, immovable rock upon which Robert E. Lee dashed his final hope. They were the wall that broke the Confederacy.
And Captain George Washington Burnell, who built Company C from scratch, who bled with them at the crater, who was carried out of the fire on their shoulders, he is there in the column. He witnesses it.
Yes, he does.
The men who were legally classified as property forced the surrender of the army that was created to keep them in chains. It is the definition of poetic justice.
It is the ultimate vindication of their motto. They proved themselves men, and in doing so, they dictated the final terms of American history.
So, after living through all of this, after taking part in the most consequential dramatic events of the 19th century, what does Burnell do? He goes home, he moves to Oshkosh, Wisconsin, he goes back to his law practice, and eventually becomes a modest, highly respected local judge. He basically never talks about the war.
No, he doesn't.
He goes to the local American Legion and Grand Army of the Republic meetings. He stands on podiums. But he never tells the story of the crater. He never talks about the rescue. He never brags about Appomattox.
It's a very common trait among veterans who have endured the absolute extremes of combat. The silence is often a reflection of an experience that is simply uncommunicable to those who weren't there. He did exactly what he set out to do, and then he quietly resumed a civilian life.
It really leaves you with something profound to mull over. We live in this hyper-connected era where every single person feels the need to broadcast every minor daily achievement on social media.
That's very true.
We demand an audience for everything we do. But here is Judge Burnell, a man who held on to a story that literally shaped the fabric of a nation, who owed his life to the incredible bravery of the black soldiers he commanded, and he kept it to himself. He just went to work. It makes you look around and wonder who in your own lives, maybe in your family tree, or even just the quiet person passing you on the street, is quietly carrying a history that could completely change the way you see the world.
But the post-historian actually transitions the research here from the chronological timeline of Burnell's life right up to the modern day.
We look at the physical remnants of these two regiments.
Right, the flags we talked about earlier, starting with the 10th Vermont flag. The very flag that Corporal Scott scooped up and saved at Monocacy.
Yes. If you go looking for it today, you will find a fascinating yet tragic intersection of history and chemistry.
Here's where it gets really interesting and incredibly ironic. That flag survived Confederate sharpshooters. It survived the heat of battle, the choking smoke, the mud, the rain.
Right.
But if you look at it today, it is an absolute ruin. And not from battle damage. It was destroyed by the very state house that was trying to honor it.
Yeah, so in the mid-19th century, a highly popular textile technique for creating vibrant, crisp flags involved manufacturing what was called weighted silk.
Weighted silk?
Silk merchants would treat the silk fabric with metallic salts, often tin or lead-based compounds.
Why?
They did this partly to sell the silk by weight for a higher profit, but also because the metallic salts gave the fabric a beautiful, lustrous sheen and a rigid stiffness that looked magnificent when a flag was newly painted and presented.
But there is a massive chemical catch.
A devastating catch. Those metallic salts act as a slow-motion chemical bomb for the organic fabric fibers.
Oh, man.
Over decades, the salts crystallize and cut into the silk on a microscopic level, causing the fabric to become hopelessly brittle and literally disintegrate into dust.
Combine that chemical bomb with the fact that for over a century, the Vermont State House hung these massive flags vertically in the open air of the rotunda, exposed to direct ultraviolet sunlight and the constant, unrelenting pull of gravity.
Exactly. The heavy, oil-based paints that were used for the central imagery of the flag acted like rigid, heavy plates on this weakening, rotting silk. Eventually, the sheer weight of the paint tore the brittle silk, and the painted center just detached and fell away.
So today, what you have remaining is a blue silk field with a ring of stars, but a gaping, tragic void right in the middle where the soul of the flag used to be.
It's heartbreaking, really.
Thankfully, the post-historian reconstructed what that missing center looked like based on the heraldry rules of the time. The center of the flag featured a pine tree, a cow, sheaves of wheat, and a green mountain.
Which represents the agrarian foundation, the natural strength, and the economic lifeblood of Vermont.
Right. And encircling that state imagery were 34 gold stars representing the states of the Union, and above it all, a majestic federal eagle. And finally, the state motto, freedom and unity.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, if we break down the design, you can see a strict, intentional heraldic hierarchy embedded in the cloth.
How so?
At the very top is the eagle, representing supreme national sovereignty. Below that is the Vermont coat of arms, representing state identity and local community.
Okay.
And at the bottom is the scroll with the specific regimental designation. It was a visual map of a soldier's layered loyalties. He fights for his brothers in the regiment, he represents the honor of his state, but all of it operates under the supreme authority of the federal union.
It's brilliant, a perfect encapsulation of the era's politics. So that's the 10th Vermont flag, a story of intense state pride and unity that is sadly deteriorating due to bad chemistry and gravity.
Yeah.
But then the research pivots to the flag of Burnell's second command, the 19th USCT. And this flag tells a completely different story. It isn't just about state pride. It is an argument for human existence.
It is. Now, tragically, no original flag of the 19th USCT survives today.
That's a shame.
They were likely lost to time, wear, or similar chemical degradation. But the post-historian was able to painstakingly reconstruct its likely design based on the house style of flags painted by David Bustill Bowser.
Who was he?
He was a prominent African-American artist in Philadelphia who designed battle flags for several USDT regiments, most notably the 127th.
The reconstruction of this flag is breathtaking just to hear described. You have a rich blue field bordered with gold fringe, which the research notes signifies an official ceremonial standard of the regular U.S. Army. But the central image is what really stops you. It's a black Union soldier in full regulation uniform, armed with a rifle, marching confidently forward. And walking right beside him, matching his stride, is the allegorical female figure of Liberty, Columbia, and she is holding the U.S. flag.
The iconographic analysis of this layout is absolutely crucial to understanding its power. Notice carefully that Liberty is walking beside the soldier.
Not above him.
Exactly. She's not floating on a cloud above him, bestowing freedom as a charitable gift from on high. She has her feet on the ground, advancing through the dirt with him.
That's amazing.
It signifies partnership. It makes the profound visual argument that liberty isn't a passive gift that is handed down to the enslaved. It is a state of being that is earned, claimed, and defended shoulder to shoulder in the crucible of war.
It's incredibly powerful. And below this image of equal partnership is a scroll that reads 19th Regiment U.S. Colored Troops.
Which is another profound repurposing of language. Colored troops was initially a bureaucratic term invented by the War Department to ensure military segregation. But when it is rendered in brilliant gold thread on a battle flag, it is fiercely reclaimed by the men fighting under it. It transforms from a label of segregation into a badge of immense, undeniable pride.
They owned it.
Completely. It becomes a collective identifier of the men who were actively, violently dismantling the institution of slavery with their own hands.
And above it all, soaring over the image is the motto, "We will prove ourselves men." This isn't just a unit marker so they know where to stand in the smoke, like we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
It's a thesis statement. It is an argument in cloth and paint demanding absolute citizenship. It is declaring to the enemy and to their own government, we are here, we are armed, we are fighting for the survival of this republic, and you will recognize our humanity.
That is the exact rhetorical weight of the banner. It visually and aggressively refutes any lingering notion that these men were marginal, secondary, or merely laborers to the Union cause. They are declaring themselves the vanguard of liberty itself.
And to think, Captain George Washington Burnell, the quiet, elite-educated lawyer from a Vermont farm family, was chosen to lead these men under that specific banner.
It's remarkable.
It brings this entire sweeping narrative full circle perfectly. We started by asking why the post-historian almost ignored this modest Oshkosh judge sitting on a stage at a 1919 rally. And the answer this incredibly deep dive provides is that history isn't just made by the generals whose names get cast in bronze, put on pedestals, and cheered by the crowds.
Right.
History is made by the captains. It's made by the privates. It is made by the families, like the Burnells in Chesterfield in Vermont, who passed down a culture of duty from 1775 right through the bloodiest days of the Civil War.
And it is made by men like Corporal Alexander Scott, defying human limits to save the colors at Monocacy so his brothers wouldn't break.
Yeah.
It is made by the men of the 19th USCT, proving their manhood and demanding their equal citizenship under a barrage of fire. The generals drew the maps in their tents, but these men, these captains, corporals, and privates, actually lived the history in the mud.
And the physical evidence of that history, the silk flags, the handwritten muster rolls, the letters, can so easily be lost forever. They get eaten away by weighted silk chemistry or lost in a courthouse fire or simply overlooked in a digital subfolder because a famous general happens to be standing nearby taking up all the oxygen.
Which is why this kind of granular, focused, local historical research is so vital. It forces us to adjust our focal point away from the roof and back down to the foundation.
Exactly. We all have historical generals in our lives that we pay attention to, the big headlines, the loud voices on social media, the people on the speaker's platform.
Right.
But it's the everyday captains of our communities, the people doing the quiet, disciplined, logistical work on the ground that actually build the reality we live in.
It's a powerful reminder of where real, lasting impact originates.
It really is. And it leaves me thinking about those flags, specifically the reconstructed one carried by Burnell's men. If the men of the 19th USCP used their regimental colors as a literal, visual argument for their right to exist as equal citizens, what are the symbols you use in your own life today to claim your space, your identity, and your values? And 50 years from now, will those symbols survive to tell your story, or will they fade and crumble like weighted silk in the sun?